This is the Rachel Show where we talk everything local news, national news, politics, election fraud, and some of my other favorite topics like bias in the media. And today I'm delighted to have on two experts on voting machine fraud that I heard speak here in Maricopa County to We the People USA Alliance recently. And I felt like it was a life-changing event for me. I was just in shock for the next few days after that. I had never had anybody connect the dots as well as these two guys did. One is Ralph Pezzullo, whose book Stolen Elections, The Takedown of Democracies Worldwide is a New York Times bestseller. And he said that he couldn't get his publisher to release his book on election fraud in 2020 involving Venezuela because they were scared of being sued. So he had to publish it himself. And my other guest is Gary Berntsen. He's a retired CIA whistleblower who commanded the CIA's elite Jawbreaker team in Afghanistan during the opening days of the War on Terror. And he was on the ground at Tora Bora directing the hunt for Osama bin Laden. So let's jump right into it, you guys. Tell us the link between Venezuela, the voting machines, and what you figured out about them being moved to the United States, where the fraud can happen through, allegedly, I don't want to get sued, Smartmatic voting machines.
Gary, you want to start?
Let Ralph begin. Ralph, you go ahead
Okay.
and open it.
All right.
No, you can start, Ralph.
Yeah. So I started. It was the spring of 2024. I was meeting with a gentleman from the DEA who was here in Los Angeles, and he asked me he wanted me to meet a friend of his who he said was the most interesting person I know, and I said sure. So I met Gary's partner, Martine Rodil, and I asked Martine, and Martine had been an investigator for the DEA, their best source ever. They all bragged about Martine. And I asked him what he was working on, and he said, I'm working on election fraud. And of course, my ears perked up because, like many Americans, after the 2020 election, I was had a lot of questions because obviously some strange things had gone on. And Martine said, I'm staying in Malibu. Come visit me tomorrow, and I'll show you a presentation that we've put together. I went there and I sat for a 4 hour PowerPoint presentation that was very extensive with all kinds of exhibits and slides and so on. And it took me completely through their investigation into election fraud, which started in Venezuela. And at the end of it, I was like, oh my God, like you said, your life changed, my life changed. And I was like, how can I help you? The American people need to know about this. And he said, we would like you to write a book. He went outside and he made a phone call, and it was to Gary. Well, I didn't know that Gary was involved with Martine, but I had known Gary for almost 20 years, right? And I said, you're working with Gary Berntsen? And he goes, yeah, Gary's my partner. Well, immediately that gave it even more importance to me. And I I met with Gary, I went to Tampa, he gave me more information, and I started to write the book. And it starts with Gary and Martine's investigation into the Cartel de los Soles in Venezuela. And I'll let Gary pick it up from there.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Martine and I had begun working together in about the end of 2017. And I had spent a lot of years working in Afghanistan after the war, after my initial involvement there, and had begun doing what I called whistleblowing. And what that was we were targeting the finances of cartels, building filings, and submitting them to the Department of Justice. And so Martine was a real expert on Venezuelan cartels. And we built our first couple of filings. And, when I had begun this business, I was accustomed to sort of the amounts of money like Iran would give. I was the chief of Hezbollah when I was in the CIA for a couple of years. I did Iranian operations. I'm a Persian speaker in addition to being a Spanish speaker. But I remember seeing 400 million, 500 million. These days, it's about $1 billion. Those were about the numbers that I saw from in between Iran being provided to Hezbollah each year. Well, once we got involved with the Venezuelans and the Cartel de los Soles, we did our first filing, and it was a $50 billion filing. Not million, billion. We would learn over time that the Cartel de los Soles was an entity worth $3 trillion because they were taking all of the base cocaine from Peru, from Bolivia, from southern Colombia, pulling it all together and then marketing it out to the world. It had become the Costco of cocaine. And at the same time, they were stealing oil. They were doing kleptocracy on oil in Venezuela. It's one of the big oil states, and gold. And they had taken over the nation state and turned it into a narco dictatorship. It turned it into a narco state, Venezuela. And in so many ways, they had been operating against the United States, and we had begun doing all of these filings. And then, of course, we did these for a couple of years. We were building these things up. 2020 came around. We saw the results of the election, and it was very unusual. And all these swing states were closed at night, and they purportedly had leaks in in Fulton County and in Atlanta. They shut down the arena, and this place is closed and that place is closed. It just didn't look right. I turned to my partner, Martin. I said, Martin, this doesn't look right. And he says, I was involved in an investigation years ago against this company, Smartmatic, that's in Venezuela, and they steal elections. They're stealing them in Venezuela. And so we began looking at Venezuela and its involvement in election theft. And we had been told by other sources that we'd been in contact. They talked about Smartmatic again and again and again, but it wasn't the money laundering or the drug trafficking that we were accustomed to. So we had to go back to those sources and say, what were you saying about Smartmatic? And then they explained how they were stealing elections and who the engineers were. So we started debriefing engineers, software engineers that actually built the first source code. So Ralph will start off now with the 2003, 2004 and the recall election.
Okay, so in Hugo Chavez, who was a military officer in Venezuela, a leftist, he was elected president in 1998. And he started nationalizing a lot of the industries in Venezuela, and the Venezuelan economy started to dip, and he started out as a popular president, but as the economy started to suffer, his popularity waned. And in 2004, he was facing a referendum as to whether or not he would continue as president or not. Hugo Chavez was very close to Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was his mentor and even his father figure. In fact, Fidel Castro used to send a plane to Venezuela every day with instructions for Hugo Chavez. So at one point during this presidential campaign, polls came out and it showed that Hugo Chavez was behind. The vote seemed to be going 60-40 against him. And Fidel Castro and his intelligence people pointed this out to Chavez, saying, look, if you don't do something, you're going to lose this referendum. And we're going to lose our sweetheart deal with Venezuela, because Venezuela was very important to the Cuban economy at that point, because after the fall of the Soviet Union had been Cuba's sort of lifeline. Their economy.
They were subsidizing seven.
Yeah, the Cuban economy was never that robust, and so Hugo Chavez was able to sell them, cheap oil, and because of all the money that, as Gary explained, that they generated through their criminal activity, they were able to support Cuba. So Fidel Castro was very invested in the Chavez regime continuing. And Chavez was sort of like, well, what do I do? And they pointed out that there was a new technology called electronic voting machines. And maybe they could find out a way to used this technology to steal an election in Venezuela. So Hugo Chavez went out, he hired three Venezuelan computer engineers who had a company that worked with banking machines. He hired these guys, he gave them money, and he said, "Can you develop a system for me?" They developed the software. Three young engineers. They were all graduates of Simon Bolivar University, which is the top engineering and computer school in Venezuela, considered their equivalent of MIT. And these three gentlemen went out and developed this software. They didn't even have voting machines at that point, so they bought Olivetti lottery machines from Italy, and they installed the software into these machines. They ran the referendum of 2004 on these machines, and they were able to steal it for Hugo Chavez in front of the eyes of international observers, including the Carter Center. Because
And you guys said that the software built in 14 ways that you could hack into it that would be hard to spot.
Okay, that is true.
Yes.
That is true. They built
Source
it.
code.
They built it so as the basic DNA of any computer system is the source code, and they were able to build it in such a way that it was almost impossible to detect how votes were being manipulated. And so after he won the referendum, Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro were both extremely pleased. They gave these three engineers $200 million, and they said, "Go off, develop this software further, and let's try to use it in elections in Central and South America." And in the early 2000s, there were a number of elections that were with surprising results where leftist candidates who were not expected to win the elections in their countries won. And it's because of the software of these three Venezuelan engineers, people like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and Evo Morales in Bolivia. Well, to Fidel Castro, this was a dream come true because he had spent his career trying to foment leftist revolutions in Central and South America. And he had done so with starting guerrilla movements. In fact, Che Guevara was killed in one of them in Bolivia, and none of them were really that successful. And here was a method to steal elections from under the noses of people using election machines. So this was in after the success in Central and South America, they decided to let's try to expand this system into the United States. And they used a company that these three engineers had founded earlier that was registered in Delaware, but the headquarters was located in Boca Raton, Florida, and it was called Smartmatic. And they're
I'd like to jump in, Ralph.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you read Ralph's book, or if you go to a website that we created called stolenelectionsfact.com, you'll see the genesis, the corporate genesis. You'll see how they start with a company called Software Softa, and then go to Vista, and then wind up at Smartmatic. And these three Venezuelans were Venezuelan Americans. And as Ralph stated, they registered the company in Delaware. It was opened in Boca Raton. Those three young men would fly into Maiquetía Airport and have their first meeting with Hugo Chavez, Jorge Rodriguez, who's the brother of the current leader there, Hugo Carvajal, who is a man in prison right now up in New York, and they would plan the creation of the source code, as Ralph stated, and its success and its exportation. And then, of course, they enter the United States, as Ralph stated, first in elections in 2006 in Cook County and in New Jersey in a Democratic primary. Both were Democratic primaries. Ironically, a Democratic congresswoman by the name of Carolyn Maloney came to know that there was hanky-panky going on in the software. And these in these election systems, and she wrote a letter to Secretary of Treasury John Snow stating that Venezuela was behind this company, and it was using a particular technology called HAAT, which was correct. It was company,
yeah.
someone close to it. It was very interesting. So they begin with their entry to the United States. They actually fly in Cook County. They fly a plane load of Venezuelans in to run the election there. And CFIUS begins an investigation of them based on Carolyn Maloney's letter. And the thing they want to know is, who are you? CFIUS wants to know, who are you? Now, you can take a look at the documents from the registration of the company here. Their names were Antonio Mujica, Roger Peñate, and Alfredo Anzola. But what you can also see on the document is a fourth name called Omar Montilla, who was the chief of staff for the dictator, Hugo Chavez. He was one of the early owners. And he was on the paperwork, at least in Florida. They did have the company. The company will then take multiple reiterations of registration and re-registration. They do it in Curacao. They do it in the Netherlands. The reason you do it in the Netherlands or Curacao, and Curacao is part of the Netherlands, it's an island off of Venezuela, that's excellent corporate secrecy in that system. So they begin this process. And then, of course, CFIUS forces Smartmatic to sell the company. And they try selling to the board, which is called SGO, and they say, no, you can't sell it to yourselves. And so then what they do is they purchase a company in the west of the United States called Sequoia. And Sequoia had been around running elections for 100 years. And they had been in California. I believe they had moved at that point. Their headquarters was in Denver. And they wind up buying Sequoia and then sticking the source code inside that system. CFIUS come right at them. Who are you? That's the question now. Are you orange? Are you? Who are you? They won't. They try selling it to the former.
Oops.
I think we just lost him.
Yeah. So what happened is that Sequoia actually applies to the state of California to run elections in California. And at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor then. There was a law where the Secretary of State had to approve any computer software that was used in elections in that state. And the Secretary of State hired a number of experts from MIT and Berkeley, and they looked at the source code and they wrote a report and they said, this source code looks like this software looks like it was written to steal elections rather than to protect elections. And they rejected it, right? So what do the engineers do? They sell Sequoia to a company in Canada, very small election company in Ontario called Dominion. But basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to fool everybody. They're trying to move their software from one country to another to disguise all throughout this whole process, never reveal that the ownership is the Venezuelan government. Right.
And you guys, since we're getting towards the end of this, can we talk also a little bit about how you told me that a former member of Congress said that nobody will do anything about voting machines because all the members of Congress are, in the pockets and owned or threats, and also the aspect that I notice that Trump and Elon Musk hammer voter ID and citizenship nonstop, but they never talk about the voting machines.
Yes, yeah. So what happened is that Gary and Martine spent about 3 years on their investigation, and they gathered all this information, all this history of how the corporate ownership and how it had been hidden and how they were able to slip through and how Smartmatic and Dominion were really the same ownership behind it. And they had made a decision that Smartmatic would run elections overseas, except for LA County in the United States, and all the swing states would be run by Dominion. And they were very strategic in terms of which districts they went after to run the elections. And a key point here is that when they got the contract to run elections in a specific district, they got all the intelligence, all the voter history, and all the voter rolls in that district. So they were able to, with the help of statisticians, they had the poll books. They could tell, who voted Democratic, who voted Republican, who had died between, this election and the past one, who usually didn't vote. So we could use those names and we could manipulate them. Like you mentioned before, those were just that there were 14 different ways that they could steal votes that were built into their system. Okay, so it was a very sophisticated system, and it has been used to steal elections in the United States since 2008. In fact, Hugo Chavez mentioned to his security director, his personal security director, he goes, "Watch me." And he said this in 2008. "I'm going to elect the first Black president of the United States." And he did it.
And what scares me, you guys, is it doesn't matter if we fix voter ID because they'll just keep, stealing the elections using these machines. And
that is the reason why today I published a letter in the Dallas Express asking the president to use President Policy Directive 21, which was initially passed in 2015 and amended in 2017, that considers election infrastructure critical infrastructure for the country, and the president can order the abolishment of those machines because they're manufactured in China. We don't want any of these machines that are manufactured in China or the software that was created in Venezuela. So I published this today in the Dallas Express, in the opinion piece. It's being circulated around, because the president's been trying to do this with the Save America Act, and you've got all sorts of people blocking him. He doesn't need any help. Using PPD 21, the president can abolish those machines, can order and make an executive order and blocks them all and returns us to paper ballots, hand count. That is how you can do it. Machines steal elections. Look, I welcome people who have been talking in the news recently. They've talked about Anthropic, the machine, the AI, also called Claude. Please use it on the software. Please let it loose on this and take a look. Ralph had mentioned earlier that in California, they had 8 engineers. Most of them were from the California university system, professors that reviewed the software, and they said, this source code looks like it was designed to steal elections. I mean, it was designed to steal elections. We know that. But there has been a worldwide effort by the media and by the left to keep these machines at play because it keeps them in power. But also, Republicans have used the machine too. They know it exists. There are some Republican governors that have used it and political figures that have benefited by the machine, because it's not just those 2 companies. It's the other companies also that are their source code is infected, or they're related in one way or another. It's like DNA, you can tell, because these Venezuelans have key Venezuelan engineers are working at the different companies. And they actually, the Smartmatic was so smart that they had one of their key employees get a job over at where's it, Bill Gates' is the Microsoft.
Yeah.
And he was able to keep them updated on the changes to Microsoft platforms so they could break in and break out, get inside them. They had one of the key Venezuelan engineers over there doing that. I mean,
very smart.
Look, these
very smart.
Yeah. He bought and operated the companies that did the engineered the paper and the printing used in elections. I mean, they had the paper and the printing, they had the audit, they had this, they surrounded the entire industry. Do you know that in the United States, It's like it's every year, it's like $6 billion for elections. Every cycle, it's like 25 billion. Globally, it's worth hundreds of billions. This is a global grift. And all the election companies and the politicians have been in on it. And we, the public, have been the suckers.
Yeah. And what Gary and Martine found, so after they finished their investigation, they started going to members of Congress, and they expected them to be shocked as they were, and everybody else is who sees this information, and they were basically not interested. The FBI told them to go away. And so they started to realize that, there are a lot of people in our country, including key decision makers in our government, we're benefiting from this system. And that's why the only way this is going to change is if the American people become aware of what's going on. Read my book, read Gary's article that came out today in the Dallas Express. Look at the website, which is stolenelectionsfacts.com. People need to educate themselves because the government and our elected officials are not bringing this to their attention because they don't care.
And
They don't care.
It's something else. Yeah, something that's so important is this. We didn't investigate this technically. We went out and recruited members of the conspiracy, people that were working for Smartmatic, people that had worked for Dominion, people that had worked for the Consejo Nacional Electoral in Venezuela. We got human sources that have come to the United States that have sat with the Department of Justice and told them how they stole our elections. The problem is the Department of Justice moves like molasses. It is so slow. The Department of Justice, oh my goodness, it takes forever.
Yep.
I try to give people context. In August of '98, the bomb. I was the CIA team leader that flew out there. I handled bomb. One of my guys handled the Nairobi thing. We would work with the FBI. We would capture those guys. I was the chief of Hezbollah at CIA in the Counterterrorism Center. So I come back, another war. I drive the Taliban out, seize the country, go back to Latin America, finish a tour. Then I'm on another tour. Back course, and they're prosecuted. We're working bombs 5 years. I mean, it's and we are
really bad.
Our democracy.
Yeah.
It is bad.
Yeah,
we are at terrible risk here.
Yeah,
we need to move quickly.
Yeah, there's another aspect of this, and that is when Elon Musk was in charge of Doge. One of the first agencies that they looked at was USAID. Right, this is our foreign aid apparatus, and in USAID they found something called CEPS, which is the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, and they found billions of dollars going to this organization. Well, when they looked closer at this organization, what it turned out to be was basically the marketing arm of Smartmatic. So U.S. taxpayers U.S. taxpayer money was being used to fund the State Department to go to their host governments and push Smartmatic technology on them. Countries like Bolivia and Georgia and Honduras and so on and so forth. 72 different countries. Yeah.
Disgusting.
Convincing them. So what it told us, what we learned from that is our intelligence agencies were working with our enemies. They were working with the people who created this software to steal our elections, to help them determine the winners of elections overseas. So this is the reason why this problem is so difficult to solve.
And you guys I want
Yeah,
to wrap up the last 5 minutes.
sure.
Since I have a lot of Arizona followers,
Yeah.
I think I sent you guys an article I wrote about how I believe 70,000 votes were flipped from Kerry Lake to the unknown Green Party candidate in the
Mhm.
last election. And
Mhm.
so you guys have also talked about, and you say this benefits Republicans. Well, I went and looked back at previous Senate elections, and I believe votes were being flipped to John McCain the same exact way.
Mhm.
Um, so taking them away from his competitors. So I believe that in the 2022 election, where all these Republicans showed up to vote on election day and they were unable to vote because of the voting machine problem, I
Yeah.
believe, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts, that a hacker hacked in and tweaked the printer settings in the reddest areas of the county to print out the wrong ballot image for the paper. And you
That
guys
is one
think,
of the ways that is one of the 14 ways that they use to steal elections. So they can shut off. There are various different ways that they have to just disable election machines and also to put the wrong date on ballots so that those ballots are rejected by the machine. There's all
oh,
kinds of these guys are experts. They continually work.
Or
You're
if
talking
the
about hundreds of engineers who are continually perfecting the system. And we're
Look, if you
the
take a
trouble
piece
is
of
that a lot
paper,
of
a
people who
ballot,
study election fraud, they look at it from outside. Well, they create the system so you can't penetrate it from outside. It's confusing because there are all these different
yeah,
methods that they're using. Yeah. Go ahead, Gary.
Ralph, I'd like to add something here
Sure.
important. When you look at a ballot, you look at the margins, right? You take a piece of paper and there's a margin, and maybe the margin's an inch and a half on both sides. If that margin is off by an eighth of an inch in either direction, it automatically creates a default in the machine after a couple of hours. Then someone has to come in from the company. They stick a thumb drive in there, and now it's loaded to with an algorithm. There's, as Ralph said, there's many techniques that allow them to come in. They allow them to enter into the operating system, and they use a thing called Eternal Blue, which was a tool that came out of NSA. And then the keys are located in three different places, and they can literally open the operating system, change votes, insert another program. With that program, they change votes. Then they can pull it out, and then they can they walk themselves out, and you never know they were there. They leave no traces. This thing was engineered, as Ralph said, by a couple of hundred engineers, computer engineers, not to just to steal election, but to steal election and defeat audit, defeat audit. And then in a lot of places, they own the audit companies. Former
incredible.
Smartmatic employees left the company and opened the audit company. So when it's audited, the
Wow.
same guys come walking back in.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. They have completely penetrated and control our election system. They
Well,
In 2000, once
real
after
quick,
we
because
saw this,
we got less than a minute left.
we walked in. Let me say this: we walked.
Drat. I think he's cutting
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. No, they control the whole system.
Well, you
That
guys,
they
Wait a
thank
minute,
you.
and the Trump administration hired. Let me finish. Hired a company that was owned by the cartel to do the investigation, and they said nothing here. They hired the cartel in 2020.
That was an amazing thing that when you guys pointed that out. But thank you so much, you guys. I would love to have you back sometime. This has been a
Sure, anytime.
fascinating interview. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. Our pleasure. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Rachel.
Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.